We're delighted that Ned Resnikoff is going to moderate this next panel. As I say, I'm not going to talk very much. Ned is a reporter for MSNBC. He is also a writer for All In with Chris Hayes. I'm old enough to remember when Chris Hayes was a boy. In fact, he still looks like a boy, doesn't he? And Ned contributes to The Baffler, Jacobin, which of course I'm old enough not to know of, and Salon. So Ned, I leave it to you. Thank you all again, audience, and thank you, panelists, very much for participating.
Great. All right, so this is the panel on solutions for working families, which is always an important discussion to have, but I think an especially important discussion now because we're in a sort of unsettling and transitional phase of the economy, going through a very lopsided recovery, moving in a lot of ways to a low-wage service sector economy, and as a result, there's been a lot of labor unrest and agitation, and I think as a direct result of that agitation, we're starting to see the beginnings of a policy response, but it's not sufficient, and we'll be able to talk about all sides of that and what more can be done. I'm joined today by Jody Levin-Epstein, who's the Deputy Director of CLASP, Avis Jones-DeWeaver, who's the former Executive Director of the National Council of Negro Women and an author, Elise Gould of the Economic Policy Institute, their Director of Health Policy Research, and Steve Savner, Policy Director of the Center for Community Change. So I'll just open it up for opening statements. Jody?
Thanks, Ned. I recently was at a fundraiser with Kevin Spacey, and he began his opening remarks by disclaiming the light and its inability to make you see the audience, and I had no idea what he was talking about, but right now I cannot see you. So my apologies if I look like I'm a little bit squinting out there. Thanks, Ned, very much, and I really appreciate all the sponsors of this event for bringing us together and having the chance to hear the voices that we already heard this morning. When you look at and think about child poverty in this rich nation, I think what's incredibly striking, good morning, what's incredibly striking, Kevin Spacey didn't have that power, this feels so great. What's incredibly striking about child poverty in our rich nation is its scope, its breadth. If you think about it, you can think about it as 16 on 16. There are 16 million poor children in the United States, and they live on about $16 per day per person in a family when they're in a family of 4. What's little understood about these poor children is that the typical poor child lives in a household with a parent who's in the workforce. 2 out of every 3 children have a parent in the workforce. 1 out of every 3 of those children has a parent who is working full-time year-round and still in poverty. There are some number of children in households that are in deep poverty who have parents who are working full year, all year round, full time. I guess those are so-called wages. It's absolutely hard to imagine working full-time, year-round, and still being in deep poverty. Now, so why is this happening? And wages in the job market, we'll hear a lot more about this from Elise. They just aren't what they used to be. It used to be that a minimum wage job would take a family of 3 out of poverty just in 1968. Not so today. And it is the case that as well, too often, low-wage work is not a stepping stone to a higher wage job. It's what John Schmidt at CEPR calls a sticky state. You get one low-wage job, you move ahead 5 cents an hour to another low-wage job, maybe 20 cents an hour. And low-wage jobs are proliferating. After this recession, particularly what we've seen is that the growth in the labor market is concentrated in these low-wage jobs. The result? Low-wage jobs and child poverty are trending. Over the last 20 years, the share of poor children with a parent working full-time year-round has significantly increased, up from 1/4 to 1/3. And these are numbers. I'm not a numbers person, but I can't not say them. They're so hefty as numbers, and they're hefty because they seem to contradict our values. that you shouldn't be in the workforce doing your level best and still be living in poverty. Now, the heart of the matter is increasing wages to get out of poverty. But it is also the case that the conditions of low-wage jobs influence both the income into the house and the outcomes for families. And I'm just going to highlight a few using the life course trajectory from zygote to adolescence, maybe taking Z to A instead of A to Z, and just going to highlight a few of these points of intervention. Let's take pregnancy at the very, very beginning. Employers, particularly low-wage employers, sometimes discriminate against pregnant workers in ways that can cause, yes, fetal stress. Now, there is a law that says you're not supposed to discriminate against pregnant workers. But what it turns out to be the case is that some employers, in fact, are not providing the kinds of accommodations that a pregnant woman needs to avoid this fetal stress. And in some situations, what they are not accommodating is something that they will accommodate to a worker who, for example, has gotten injured. And there's a story of a pregnant truck driver, for example, who just simply didn't want to lift for a temporary period of time as much weight as she had been assigned. Exactly the kind of accommodation that had been made for a worker who was injured, not made for her, a pregnant worker. There's a solution. There's a federal bill that's pending, the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. There's activity at the state level. Let's take birth. Moms need time to recover. Children, whether adopted or not, need time to bond with parents. But few employers provide paid family leave. That results in only 5% of low-wage workers actually having paid family leave. And what's really astonishing is that nearly a quarter of women who took leave, whether paid or unpaid, took 10 or fewer days of leave. APA, I'm sure you could say and tell us more about the significance of having such a short amount of leave. Yet family leave increases the likelihood of a woman returning to her job. The first year of life, you know what? Babies get sick. They need wellness visits as well. And children sometimes have chronic illnesses and serious illnesses, particularly in that very important first year of life. Yet, the vast majority of low-wage workers, 70%, lack access to paid sick days. Some low-wage workers have no paid leave whatsoever. Tell your neighbors this. No paid personal days, no sick time, no family leave, and no vacation. Nearly half of all workers in the lowest 25% of wages fit in this category. The lack of these leaves, it's not just a perk. This is about losing your wages when you have to take Johnny for a flu shot. And it also is translating into the loss of jobs. Almost 1 in 5 low-wage moms report having lost a job due to sickness or caring for a family member. A solution? It's right there. Most other nations, they have paid leave laws. The United States does not, and we sure could. Childcare. To go to work, a parent has to have childcare. Subsidized childcare is available to very few eligible families. Less than 20% of those who are eligible are getting subsidized childcare. And poor families that pay for childcare spend an estimated 30% of their income on childcare. And there can be some hidden costs to childcare. A study of high school dropouts found that 26% of kids who dropped out of high school dropped out for caring responsibilities, including the need to take care of a sibling. A solution? Right there. More federal and state funding. Stable home environments. From infancy on, we know that stability in the home is key to development. Work schedules that are erratic and unpredictable make stability incredibly challenging. I want to close with a story that I'm going to read from a Walmart mom. Gail Todd wrote the following. At first, I had what Walmart calls an open schedule, meaning that I had to be available to work any shift on any day. My shifts were all over the place. And every week it was different. Finding childcare, especially on short notice and with an irregular schedule, was a constant challenge. Ultimately, it became impossible to be available 24/7 for Walmart. And with my change in availability, Walmart, you got it, cut my hours. Unquote. This is a vicious cycle, but it does not have to be this way. Let's just look at Costco. But inequality begins at birth is a helpful framing for our focus in on child poverty. You know, there are those who decry a cycle of poverty and ascribe it to the failure of families. It's really kind of time for us now to recognize that how low-wage work, which ought to be a stepping stone to higher income jobs and a path to the middle class, instead is too often contributing to this cycle. We have the solutions. You heard that this morning. You'll hear more of them today. It's not rocket science. We just need to get there and find a way to make what we know works happen.
Great, thank you.
Good afternoon. It's definitely a pleasure to be here today. Horrible following Jody, though, I have to say.
I
love
always
her.
think the same.
I love her. You know, when I think of this issue of addressing child poverty, in my mind, there are two things that absolutely need to be on the table and be top priority. Number one is really getting very real about developing a very substantive plan to address deep poverty in America. We cannot save poor children if we completely ignore the plight of the deep poor. The second thing we need to focus on is addressing the needs of low-wage mothers. And so I'm going to briefly talk about each of those two. First, as it relates to deep poverty in America. Really, when you look at the issue of deep poverty, I would argue that it is absolutely impossible to address it unless we invest the time, the resources, the creativity that is needed, and in fact grow the will to repair this nation's tattered safety net. It will not happen on its own. There is not enough charity in the world. We need to repair our social safety net if we are to address deep poverty in this nation in a very real and substantive way. And I'll give you an example of what happens when you don't do that. As we all know, we just recently experienced the deepest, most entrenched recession that this nation has faced since the since the Great Depression. And what did we see in terms of our primary social net program, TANF, during that period of time? If you look at what happened with TANF over the course of the Great Recession, logic would tell you that you would have seen increases in the caseloads because there are more and more people, record numbers of people losing their jobs, staying off their jobs for longer periods of time. And so logic would dictate that you would have had increases in the TANF rolls. That's precisely what didn't happen. What we saw with TANF over the course of the Great Recession was we saw continued decreasing of the welfare rolls all across the nation during the period of the Great Recession. Not only that, we saw that in many states we had increases in sanctioning of TANF recipients. So individuals who are already receiving very meager levels of cash assistance actually had that cash assistance cut quite substantially, almost in half, according to one study by the National Women's Law Center, during the height of the recession. That to me is completely counter to what was needed, especially given the fact that we know during that same period we had record increases in poverty. Also at that time, we know that we embraced wholeheartedly in this nation the farce of austerity, correct? We saw this Congress continue to slash and burn and cut programs that were specifically developed to meet the needs of increasing poverty. And precisely at the time where we had more and more people who needed those programs, we saw those programs get cut to the bone. Even with sequester, those programs that were specifically meant to address the needs of children, things like WIC, things like Head Start that we just spoke about a few minutes ago, cut to the bone. And even though we're in a post-sequester period, even though we are beginning this very sort of rugged and detached recovery period, we have not had those programs made whole again in a true sense. And they are nowhere near where they need to be in terms of meeting the need. So we are not meeting our social contract I would argue, in terms of creating a nation where ideally we set a standard, where we morally say we will not let anyone fall below that standard. We are missing in action when it comes to meeting that social contract. The second thing I want to talk about today is meeting the needs of working women, particularly low-wage workers. Now, there is one concept that we have to embrace fully in this country, and it's a very simple concept, and that concept is women work. That's it, period, point blank period. Women work. And a lot of us work, not just because we like to, not just because it's something that we want to do. We work because it's something that we have to do. What we provide for our families is a very critical component of what makes that family whole financially. We make up today nearly half of the labor force. Fully 47% of all workers in America are women. But when you look at low-wage workers, fully 3/4 of low-wage workers are women. So we are the vast majority of low-wage workers. And we all know about the wage gap when it comes to the overall labor force. Guess what? There's also a wage gap when you look at low-wage workers. Low-wage working women still suffer pay differentials as compared to low-wage working men. So not only are they receiving low wages, they're receiving comparatively lower wages than their male counterparts in similar jobs. Now, these women oftentimes have the responsibility of taking care of children. Fully 1 out of every 4 low-wage working women has a child that she is responsible for that's 18 or under in her household. So they are bringing home money that they need to be able to take care of their children. One of the things that we definitely need to fight against is this farce, this sort of false narrative that's being put out there in terms of who is the low-wage worker, right? Every time you hear other people sort of frame this discussion, the image that they want to put in people's minds is this idea of this pimply-faced teenager who's out there working because he just needs some extra income to be able to go out on the weekends and kick it with his friends. That is not the typical low-wage worker. The typical low-wage worker works full-time, by the way, relies on that income to support their family. The typical low-wage worker is a woman, and the average age of the low-wage worker is 35 years of age. That is not a pimply-faced teenager. That is a grown-up who is trying to do what they need to do in order to put food on their table every day. So what do we need to do to specifically help women who are in low-wage jobs? A number of the things that I would mention are some of the very same things that Joni mentioned here. We need to make sure that, first of all, that they are paid fairly. So we need to make sure that we have an increase in the minimum wage, particularly as it relates to tipped workers, which is absolutely ridiculous. And we need to make sure that any increases in the minimum wage is indexed for inflation, so that as the cost of products and services increases, those families can then afford to pay for those increases in costs of products and services. Another thing that we really need to focus on when it comes to low-wage workers, once again, is expand access to affordable and quality child care. You know, there have been several studies out there that have shown that in some states, child care costs actually exceed the cost of college tuition in that state. Poor families then can't afford it. So what do they have to do in order to sort of make that sort of necessity a reality in their lives? They have to rely on informal networks that oftentimes are not as reliable, that may not provide the best quality, not in all circumstances, but it may not provide the best quality. And so they're in a situation where they can't always rely on that child care to be there when they need it. Or if it's there, it might not be providing the best atmosphere for their child, for the development and growth of their child. And the third thing that we need to make sure that we have access to, once again, is paid leave. Critically important. No parent should be stuck in a situation in which they have to make the sort of hard decision about whether or not they want to be a responsible parent or whether or not they will be a dedicated employee. Because at the end of the day, when they make the right decision, in my mind and in your mind, and they're there for their sick child, or they're there in meeting with their teacher, or they're doing some other necessity to make sure that their family stays whole, they are in essence putting their job in jeopardy. And that once again creates a situation that will keep them and their children relegated to poverty. Thank you.
Now I have to follow both of you. That was fantastic. Those are great ideas. I'm going to concentrate my thoughts really on wages. We've touched around the wage issue a little bit, but I want to make an argument today and talk about some policies that we can really look at, that wage growth is key to reducing poverty in this country. What we know is that the bottom fifth of American households rely on wages for the vast majority of their income. So if we look at the income sources, nearly 70% of income for low-wage households, low-income households, is coming from wages, benefits, if they get them, right? They don't really get them, but wages, benefits, and other wage-related safety net programs like the EITC, right? So our safety net has slowly gone from one that is not dependent on work to one that is more dependent on work. So you can't even get access to some of these programs unless you're working. So 70% of low-income families depend on wages. 70% of their income is from wages. So it's clear that boosting wages is important for reducing poverty. And certainly efforts targeted at the safety net are well deserved. Well, we've heard some of them already. Programs such as TANF, SNAP, unemployment insurance, Social Security have helped reduce poverty over the last 4 decades. But market-based poverty has been on the rise, and the safety net has to work even harder to counterbalance the growing inequalities of the labor market. In fact, if poverty had continued to fall as the economy grew in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, then we would have eradicated poverty in 1985. There was some mention that, the official poverty measure doesn't measure everything adequately, and that's absolutely the case. It doesn't include things like SNAP. It doesn't include things like EITC. Even if we were to include those things, I went back and ran that same regression, and I am a numbers person, so you can ask me numbers. We would have poverty would be very close to zero if we had continued to have the kind of broadly shared prosperity that we had in the 3 decades following World War II. So we have seen that kind of an economy that can reduce poverty, and we can see it again. Furthermore, unlike some of you maybe have been led to believe, the impact of rising income inequality and wage inequality is nearly 5 times more important in explaining poverty than family structure. It's not about family structure. It's about wage inequality. It's about the growing divergence between those at the very top and everybody else. So it's really important that we don't leave wages on the table when trying to fight poverty. So how do we increase wages? We've heard a little bit about the minimum wage. We need to think about all the different ways we can to improve low-wage work, improve job quality, get benefits, get wages better for everybody. Minimum wage is not primarily an anti-poverty tool. It's a basic labor standard. We need to make sure that people are getting paid for the work that they do in this economy. Low-wage workers are more educated than ever before, and they're not being paid for it. They're more productive, they are working harder, they're working more hours, and they're not getting paid for it. The minimum wage is currently more than 25% below its real value in the late 1960s, and the minimum wage is well targeted. Over 25 million people would see a raise from an increase to $10.10 an hour, the current amount that's on the table. The Congressional Budget Office reports that $5 billion would go to people living below the poverty threshold if we raise the minimum wage to $10.10. And other academic research finds that it would lift 4 or 5 or sometimes 6 million people out of poverty, depending on how you measure people living near that wage. 55% of those who would see a raise from an increase in the minimum wage are women. 25% of those helped are women of color. And nearly 1 in 5 kids would see at least one parent get a raise. So the minimum wage is key. Hand in hand with the minimum wage is the Earned Income Tax Credit, the EITC. It's targeted to help low-income families, but can't be done without the minimum wage. As the Congressional Budget Office reports, many of the benefits that are targeted in the EITC actually benefit low-wage employers, because they create an incentive for workers to actually accept lower wages because they're getting this tax benefit. 25% of that benefit actually goes in the pockets of low-wage employers, and therefore they're not seeing that full benefit. We need the minimum wage to create a floor to make sure the wages don't get pushed down anymore. So in combination, the minimum wage and the EITC can do a lot to lift wages. Promoting unions. The decline in unionization has led to increases in wage inequality, loss of bargaining power for workers, and a shift in work culture. Unions have historically done more to lift the wages of non-unionized workers and raise labor standards generally. And the decline in unionization is not a natural, inevitable phenomenon. Instead, a result of a policy failure that didn't keep the playing field level for organizing drives in the face of growing employer aggressiveness. And there's evidence. Unionization has so far held up much better in the public sector, where employers have less ability to fight organizing drives. In 2007, the share of non-union workers who said they wanted to be represented by a union or a similar organization reached an all-time high. Over 50% of non-union workers want to be in a union. There's a growing wedge between the desire to organize and bargain collectively and the ability to do so. And even the most obvious form of employer aggressiveness, firing of workers who are trying to organize, has been on the sharp rise in recent decades. And according to much research, the decline of unions can explain about a third of the growth of wage inequality among men and about a fifth of the growth among women since the 1970s. So declining unionization has directly led to rising wage inequality and has also directly led to increases in people working, not being able to support a family above the poverty line. And union efforts recently in many low-wage occupations have directly impacted the wage and benefits of low-income families. These are workers who are working in food preparation, cashiers, cafeteria workers, childcare workers, cooks, housekeepers, and home care aides. These are all professions that can be unionized. We've seen union wages lift many of these families out of poverty. Other things that often don't get mentioned and left on the table: reducing wage theft. Examples include working off the clock, widespread evidence from tipped workers, failing to get their wages, to Apple employees, right, required to stand in line after the shift has ended to get their bags checked, working off the clock maybe for half an hour, just standing in line. In nearly 9,000 investigations of the restaurant industry, the Wage and Hour Division of the Department of Labor found about 84% were in violation, underscoring the enforcement problems. We can update overtime rules. One reason low and moderate wage workers have seen slow wage growth is that millions of workers are working overtime and not getting paid for it. And that's because the federal wage and hour law is out of date. The overtime exemption has been stuck at $450 a week for a long time. Back in 1975, in today's dollars, it was $985 a week. We're comparing about $24,000 annually compared to over $51,000 in 1975. So workers in this wage group now, between 24,000 and 51,000, are no longer getting paid for overtime. If we were to change those overtime rules, which is actually in the hands of the Department of Labor, the Obama administration is not dependent on Congress to make some of these changes. If we could change those rules, then millions of families would be helped. Millions of low-income families would be helped. Many other issues, I'm sure I'm running out of time, dealing with misclassification. So there's many workers who don't even know how to bargain with their employer because it's not even clear who their employer is. Construction workers who are treated as independent contractors, so the employer doesn't even have to pay for their workers' comp benefits. So there's so many violations because the workplace has changed pretty dramatically. We need things like guaranteed minimum work hours. Jody has already mentioned sort of the problems with scheduling and not getting enough hours. And employers today, they use all these fancy computer programs to get the employees there just when they need them, and that makes it impossible for employees to get enough hours to make ends meet or to even get childcare for those hours that they have. Equal pay, pay transparency, while over wage inequality, I would argue, is the biggest factor holding back workers of both genders and all races and ethnicities. Closing gender and racial wage gaps is also of prime importance to today's families. Many of the policies I've already mentioned already will disproportionately lift the wages of women and of people of color. And Jody mentioned other extremely valuable workplace benefits. We need to get paid sick days, we need to get paid family and medical leave, we need flexible work hours. All these things will disproportionately help low-income families and help children. So we need to enforce the labor standards we have, update the ones that need it, and put power back in the hands of workers to bargain for better working conditions for themselves and their families. Insufficient wages coupled with mounting uncertainty and stress, as we heard, stress is really important, is damaging to the lives of workers and their children. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention how important the social safety net is for low-income families in this country. Everything from shoring up SNAP to expanding Medicaid to those poor people in states who didn't take those Medicaid expansions. We should have universal pre-K and affordable and high-quality childcare. We need to use every tool in our toolbox to help children in poverty. And we can't leave the tool of rising wages on the table. That has to be part of an anti-poverty plan. And my time is up. Thank you.
Well, all three are a very tough act to follow. And I guess the way I would start is by saying that the Center for Community Change, where I work, works mostly with groups around the country that are organizing in low-income communities, trying to engage low-income people, build leadership in low-income communities and communities of color so that they can have a voice in deciding how they want their community to be, what policies they want to see at the local level and the national level. And when we think about what we've just heard, we have a lot of ideas about what's causing the problems that we're all concerned about. We have a lot of ideas about what could be done to fix those problems. We are confident, I think, and Jody mentioned it explicitly, that the situation we're facing right now is not consistent with our values, and that doing the kinds of things that we've heard about is very consistent with our values. So the question is, why are we in this situation, and why does it seem so hard? Why does it seem in some cases so hopeless, here in Washington in particular, that we're going to see the kinds of changes that we want, that we're going to see a set of rules that are consistent with our values? And I think from our perspective at the center, that is about the failure of all of us to do enough to build the political power that we need to change the situation. We have, for the past 30 years, and Elise talked about, if we had kept up the policies that were in place during the post-war period from the 40s to the 70s, we would have eradicated poverty potentially by the mid-80s, I think, or the early 90s. But since the late 1970s, a lot of things have happened. Most importantly, what's happened has been we have increasingly become politically held in the sway of very conservative ideology that basically says that we need less government, we need lower taxes, we need less regulation. And all of those things will promote growth and will make us all better off. And we've got 30 now, almost 40 years of experience with lower taxes, lower regulation, more limited government. And the truth of the matter is that it's making the top 1% much better off, and it's making everybody else pretty much worse off, and particularly low-income folks. So I think that's all sounds pretty grim and negative, but I think what I'd like to say from now on is that we think that the time is changing, that there's a growing recognition that who is benefiting from the current regime. I think it really started with the Occupy movement in some respects that highlighted this notion that, and really tapped into some energy that people had and an understanding that only the very wealthy were doing well and everybody else was really suffering, and a lot of it had to do with the labor market. And I think that's more recently. There's been the fast food workers strikes that have been led and supported by SEIU in many parts of the country. People walking off fast food jobs, demanding better treatment. They're the first ones who raised the $15 an hour demand for wages. So we've seen that. And then more recently, we've seen in a number of communities really progressive populist leadership elected, along with building political power. And to begin with, it's happening primarily at the local municipal level, but in some states, where we see elected officials really willing to act on what our real values are and to really combat the sort of growing inequality that we've seen in the consistent undermining of working people. So, for example, we worked with groups in Seattle, Washington Community Action Network, and One America, along with SEIU, who played a leading role, and just recently winning a $15 an hour minimum wage in the city of Seattle. And researchers there suggest that for working people, that will have about a 15 to 20% decrease in the poverty rate in the city of Seattle when that's fully implemented. So a 20% decrease in poverty by virtue of raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. And it takes a strong movement. It takes low-income folks to be organized. It takes small business. It takes service providers. So there were lots of groups and people who contributed to that victory and who will be needed to contribute to those kinds of victories all around the country if we're going to be successful. And our sense is that we need to be doing that work at the local level, building up and doing it at the state level. And at the same time, we use those victories to engage more people. In order to organize people to get them involved in this fight, people have to have some sense of hope. They have to have an aspirational demand, like $15 an hour, like a schedule that actually suits what a working mother needs, and the potential that we can actually win this. And so I think we've got both of those things now developing in several parts of the country. New York is another place where people are looking to those kinds of successes, just passed paid sick days and then improved it. Minneapolis, there's a number of places. Boston has a new progressive mayor, San Francisco. So those sound like, oh, it's easy there. And in some respects, it's certainly easier there than in other places. But we've got to start somewhere, and we've got to lift up those victories to give hope to workers and others in other parts of the country that they can do the same if they get involved, if they get engaged. It's about voting, but it's about much more than voting. It's about actually being engaged in efforts to win these kinds of changes and demand these kinds of changes. So I think we're very hopeful. A couple folks have raised this issue about scheduling. Just for example, this is, Elise talked about the just-in-time scheduling, where computers determine for every hour of every day how many workers are needed, and people get called frequently the night before what hours they've got the next day. Well, obviously, if you're a parent, you can't arrange childcare based on not knowing until the night before when you're going to work the next day. The Retail Action Project in New York has organized several thousand retail workers that's working on this very issue, making demands at the city level for a policy that would require notice and stable schedules over a period of time. The CTAC living wage ordinance required that employers give part-time workers full-time hours before they brought on other part-time workers. That was the first victory on $15 an hour that's not being challenged in court. So there are efforts, it's not just wages, it's the other rules about employment that make it possible to be successful on the job, and that's of course a particularly important issue for caregivers. So that's how we're approaching this issue. I also share, I think, with everybody on the panel, and particularly in terms of what Elise was saying, our assessment is that while we need to defend and strengthen the safety net programs and work supports like childcare and the EITC, the central issue that we've got to tackle if we're really going to make a significant dent in poverty is wages. And we've got to restore what was a solid link in the post-war years between wages and productivity. As workers during the post-war period up until the 70s, as workers produced more for every hour of work they did, they got paid more. Since the late 1970s, productivity has continued to rise at a fairly reasonable clip, but wages have stagnated. That's the other side of the inequality story, the 1% getting everything and workers getting very little. Workers are producing more value, and they're not getting the benefit of that in their paycheck. And that's what we have to stop. We have to restore that link between productivity and wages. We can do that through minimum wage. We can do that through organizing workers to get a demand and win wages above the minimum, which is critical. And then the other thing we need to do is to put everybody back to work. We need to get down to 3 or 4% unemployment. That will in itself create more pressure, upward pressure on wages. And we think that a demand for full employment is very consistent with American values. People want to work. People want to be working, they want to be supporting their families, and they want to contribute. So we think that demands around wages and productivity and full employment are key to raising wages, are consistent with people's values, and over time are winnable if we do the kind of organizing and civic engagement that we need to do.
So I'm told that while we're having this conversation, down the street, Congressman Paul Ryan is having a hearing on poverty, and I don't want to speculate about what they're saying there. I imagine it's a slightly different conversation than one we're having here, but I want to note that generally when elected officials, particularly elected officials in Washington, talk about work and poverty, they usually use the word opportunity. We need to create more opportunity, create ladders of opportunity. And so I wanted to ask all of the panelists, do you think that's an accurate diagnosis of what's going on? And what does it mean, I guess?
Well, I think we do want more opportunity. I think nobody disagrees about that. Mm-hmm. I think the issue is that the prescriptions that Paul Ryan and many conservatives have are not actually going to result in opportunity. And I think the problem is that it's hard to create opportunity for people when the labor market that they're going into does not pay them for the work and the value that they produce. If there are no jobs, then you can create you can't create opportunity. You can't create opportunity simply by giving people more training unless there are jobs for them. Mm-hmm. So and training is just one of the things that is frequently pointed to as around opportunity. We need more training. We need more education. We need better quality education. But those things in and of themselves will not create real opportunity because the economic structures that are out there are not making the jobs available that people would get or could get.
I want
Yeah,
to ditto what Steve is saying and underscore that I think what some of these numbers are telling us, and at least you'll be able to amplify, is that an astonishing number of people who are working remain poor. And that says something about how people are taking the opportunities, but those opportunities are not giving them what I think everyone else expects they should have from that work effort. So it's a perversion of the word opportunity, I think, is what we're struggling with here. When people are working full-time year-round and still they and their children are living within poverty or even extreme poverty. So it's a testimony, I think, to the wherewithal of people to really be striving to take advantage, but then the stickiness problem comes in the way. You take this job, you think it's going to be a stepping stone, you think you're going to move up on the ladder and make more and better wages, but the opportunity is not really an opportunity, and I think that that's exactly the problem.
Right. I absolutely agree with both of you. Economic mobility in this country is low. It's been low for a long time. It's low compared to our peer countries, and we should absolutely do something about it. It's not only because it's the right thing to do, it's actually a good thing for our economy as well. We should be promoting the most skilled, talented people, no matter who their parents were, where they were when they started out. But we can't get distracted from thinking about income inequality and reducing poverty and focus only on mobility. Because if we were to keep the rungs of the ladder in the same places, right? So the income distribution, the wage distribution, exactly the same. If somebody moves up, it automatically means that somebody else is going to move down. So we need to do whatever we can to really lift up that whole ladder and make those low-wage jobs be better jobs and reduce poverty and do all of those things so that wherever you fall on that ladder, it's not the worst place to be in this economy. So we need to do both of those hand in hand, both increase economic mobility and really do as much as we can to reduce income inequality and reduce poverty.
I just find Paul Ryan's contextualization of the issue, broadly speaking, just to be disingenuous. There is nothing that he has ever put on the table that I've seen that would actually result in people having the opportunity or having the ability to be able to work their way out of poverty in this country. As we've all sort of laid out here, you can work and work and work in this country and still live a very precarious life and still live deeply embedded in poverty. And this idea of opportunity is a nice sort of buzzword, but is it a reality in people's lives when you find yourselves in neighborhoods that really are a wasteland in terms of being able to have access to good quality jobs, being able to have access to transportation, being able to have access to quality childcare, all of those things that you need, and having your children be able to have access to quality schools, all of those things that all of us need and know that we need in order to create this sort of American dream idealized lifestyle. And instead what he typically does, and we all know, is to sort of flip it around and frankly blame the victim for the circumstances that they find themselves in. We have no problem with giving all sorts of tax giveaways and other benefits that cost this nation billions of dollars to those at the very top, corporations and individuals. But when we talk about being able to provide individuals who are struggling the sort of resources that they need to make it, that will then be immediately reinvested into the economy, that will in fact be stimulative to the economy. All of a sudden, people like Paul Ryan have a problem with it. I just have a very hard time taking him seriously at all with any discussion on poverty.
Well, on that note, one of the things that he does talk a lot is this idea of welfare dependency. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned TANF as a program that has failed to cover a lot of people in the aftermath of the recession. One of the things that TANF did is, I think, move welfare in the United States to a slightly more disciplinary model, where you need to behave in certain ways or meet certain requirements before you get just like a very baseline of help. And so, broadly speaking, is that idea of means testing and work requirements something that we should really stay away from and focus on just universal benefits? Or is there a role for that in creating a more robust safety net?
I'll start here and say that I think that the rhetoric around TANF was this idea of creating a situation where people would work towards self-sufficiency. And I've done a lot of research with TANF recipients specifically who are looking to gain access to college education so that they could truly become self-sufficient, so that they could get the credentials that they need in order to be able to make above poverty level wages. And what they have found in practice is that oftentimes, in terms of how TANF is implemented, they have roadblock every step along the way. So the way that the program is structured, it really does not create a system, frankly, of self-sufficiency. It creates a system where people are regimented and relegated to having to have certain hours that, by the way, for jobs that don't provide above poverty level wages. And so it basically keeps people, in my mind, stuck in a cycle of poverty such that even after they have timed out, it's hard for them to be able to have what they need to be able to get the type of jobs that will have them to have access to above poverty level wages. I think there are much better ways in which we can support individuals to be able to make sure that they have access to the education and the training and the opportunities and the supports that they need, the wraparound supports that they need to really become self-sufficient. There is no silver bullet, and definitely TANF is not it.
I think the problem that I have, and that I think many people have with both the TANF and the welfare reform law that was passed in '96 and what we've seen since then, is that the premise for the law and the premise for the concerns about welfare dependency is that people would rather scam the system than have a chance to work and support their families, and that's the predominant problem that we face. So we create this moral hazard when income is available to folks. Their natural tendency is to take advantage of it and not do what they can to support themselves. I just think that that's not true. It's not what I've seen working with low-income folks. I think it's we don't. If we look at the number of low-income folks, single mothers, who primarily are the folks who used to get AFDC and who now get TANF, how many of them are out there struggling heroically to deal with the low-wage labor market, childcare, and all the things that they need to do to take care of themselves and their families. Folks aren't lazy; they're not trying. So the problem isn't that people aren't trying. People are trying very hard. So we've set up a system and a set of rules that, rather than being premised on people want to get ahead and how do we help them, they're premised on people want to rip the system off and how do we stop them. Yeah. And that leads us to two very different kinds of systems. So I think that's, again, and I think it's also deeply racist. I think the premise for this, I did work on welfare issues back in the 80s and 90s, and the premise for this, the image of the single mom on welfare was that she was an African-American woman who was not doing what she should to take care of her child, to be out in the labor market. Even at the time, most people on AFDC were white. That was the image. And I think the talk about personal responsibility tapped into a lot of racial feelings and racial prejudices that has made it possible for them to get over with these kinds of policies.
And what's indisputable is that the TANF program is failing. The share of poor children, just looking at the universe of those kids who are poor, who actually get this program that is meant for the poorest children and their parents, has dropped so significantly since 1996, between 1996 and 2009. It used to be that about 63% of those poor children had access to TANF, and it's dropped to 23%. So what are we doing?
Right, and we're not providing opportunities for people to say no to really terrible jobs, right? So people complain Walmart jobs are bad jobs, and yet a Walmart opens and there's a line of people out the door trying to get those jobs because they can't stay on TANF because unemployment insurance benefits don't allow you to wait for a job that is more suitable for your skills. You have to take the job that you're offered, and so we've created an economy that really doesn't put any power into the hands of people by creating these types of incentives.
And Elise, you listed a long series of possible policy remedies, and it seems like a lot of those it would be difficult to implement with this Congress. But I'm wondering if
Really?
just speculation on my part. But in the meantime, is there anything that can be done without Congress There was the federal contractor executive order that was passed. Is there anything else that the White House could do unilaterally to improve this situation?
Well, the overtime protections, they can make changes on the overtime protections, and absolutely have more people out there on the ground trying to enforce labor standards, reduce wage theft, right? So if we could, maybe that will take Congress as well, but there are things that we can do that are actually on the books, and if we could enforce them, that would help a tremendous number of low-wage people. But as Steve was saying, I mean, there are fights at the local level, and we can concentrate and really, I mean, it's great what you guys did in Seattle. I mean, it's amazing, really, how much that is going to actually impact everyday people, lift, I mean, as you said, many, many people out of poverty. I think that we have to focus on those wins, and I am optimistic. I think that we can move in the right direction, and we need also to have candidates out there that are going to take on these agendas and push them and get elected.
One thing that we haven't talked about, and the president really could act in this area, is around immigration. We have right now, the estimates are 10 to 12 million undocumented folks in this country. Most of them are working, and most of them are exploited at work and can't stand up for themselves because they're undocumented, because they fear and are at great risk of deportation. If they had legal status and the ability to challenge an employer who was not treating them fairly or not treating them legally, that would lift up their wages, and it would lift up other people's wages as well. And while we are all, and the president is supportive of enactment of comprehensive immigration reform legislation, while that isn't happening, or to the extent it's not going to happen during this Congress, he has the power, like he did with children, the Dreamers, to create legal status and provide a legal status and the ability to work for virtually all of the undocumented people who are here. If he wanted to do that, he uses his administrative power to do that. Congress would scream, there might be an effort to impeach him, but he could do that. And I think that would, there would be a lot of support for that kind of action, and it would have a big impact on poverty and wages.
All right, I guess we're ready to take questions from the audience now.
I'm just curious. Many of us want to support, I'm a pediatrician, so I'm not an economist, okay? And so when I hear on NPR about the minimum wage being raised, which is, I heard about the Seattle success, the pushback is always, well, if we get minimum wage, that means we can't employ as many people, and so this is going to make unemployment go up. What's the argument to that those of us who are not as educated around economy, what can we say back to that?
The consensus really is that there are no employment effects in the negative direction. So I get what you're saying. The basic sort of microeconomic story would be that we raise wages and therefore there'll be fewer people working. The evidence out there, the empirical evidence out there, pretty much says that effect is zero, or it's indistinguishable from zero, and so that is a very, very small effect. It's not surprising, actually. If you think about raising wages for people at the bottom, and it's sort of, you pointed at the Costco versus Walmart model, right? Encouraging employers to take the high road. You're going to reduce turnover. You're going to reduce, the need to then retrain and rehire and do all those things. You're going to have more loyalty among your employees if you have a higher wage. So there are absolutely some benefits that can be offsetting. Also, we have seen very high profits, and there is a way to raise wages that doesn't necessarily cut into business in any other way, except maybe compressing the wage structure in some of these large corporations. So there are a lot of different avenues that can be approached, and the minimum wage does not have any significant impact at all. Does that help? Hopefully.
The other thing that we did a lot of organizing among small businesses in Seattle and elsewhere. And I think one of the things that even small business people, and who aren't the one percenters, are supportive of this, many of them. And the reason they're supportive of it is because while on the one hand it makes their costs somewhat bigger to pay people $15 an hour, if everybody in the community is making at least $15 an hour, people have more money to spend and there's more business, so there's more demand. So there's trade-offs that, yes, they'll be paying somewhat more to their workers, but there'll be more business in the community, there'll be more economic activity, and that I think has the potential to more than offset the fact that they may be making a little less profit if wages are higher. They'll make that up by doing more sales or production or whatever it is that the small business does.
Hi. So I had a question about something that hasn't necessarily been talked about as much, but oftentimes, especially for young mothers, the birth of a child could interrupt their education. And so what are some policies, some solutions that could enable mothers, young mothers, to be able to continue that education and then increase their opportunities?
There's a project over at the Institute for Women Policy Research. Who's here from IWPR? Anybody?
Well, I'm an IWPR alum, so
There you
maybe
go.
I can.
There you go. In which one of the focuses is on provision of childcare, particularly at community colleges, particularly for young moms, and making sure that that support service is there for the person going through education and probably also at the same time working a part-time, full-time job. And they're going to be coming out with some evaluation and assessment of that strategy as a solution because it, in fact, will enhance the capacity to avoid poverty.
The other thing, and CLASP actually done a lot of work on this over the years, is that a lot of financial aid rules are premised on individual students who don't have dependents. So that's sort of the typical student being a young person who's being supported, doesn't have a family, doesn't have children. So the financial aid calculations and rules don't do very well for what are called independent students who don't have parental support and who may have dependents of their own. So I think changing, and of course we know that the whole scandal of student debt is on everyone's mind right now, but I think that one of the things that can be done is to make the calculations of financial aid more realistic, and of course to make more financial aid available.
Sorry. I'm Tiffany, by the way. Actually, I was wondering if any of you had done research. I know there's been a lot around Walmart wages, but what the cost to government is for low wages. You know.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so there's been some research that looks at expansions of food stamps. Sorry, if you increase the minimum wage, how many fewer people would then need government dollars for food stamps? I often think that in the austerity sort of climate that we have, the idea that we can only put policy forward that is actually deficit neutral or deficit reducing is absolutely the wrong way to go. I understand the political climate, but I think that thinking about these savings from programs, and maybe that would even lower families' income when their wages go up, is problematic. But there is absolutely research out there. I personally, I think if you're going to get some savings, then let's throw it into other things. Let's throw it into other things like childcare. So if you have a job that you now have more hours and now you don't get some other benefits, let's make sure that your family income doesn't drop, and let's shore it up. Let's give you childcare. Let's give you more food stamps. Let's give you all these other things that are absolutely going to help your family. So there is some research out there, but it's limited, and I'm actually going to be coming out with some this fall. So look out.
Stay tuned.
Stay tuned. Yeah.
May I ask a question, Ned? As we've discussed before, incarceration is a huge problem in America. What about jobs for ex-prisoners, even those with light sentences? Have you thought about that? Have you have any proposals on that?
We're actually doing a fair amount of work on reducing barriers to employment for people who've been incarcerated. There's been a lot of success. One of the ways that this plays out in the workplace is that on an employment application, there'll be a question that asks if you have a criminal conviction or a criminal record. And if you check yes on that, then your application is thrown aside. So they don't even get to meet the person to find out what the conviction was for, how long ago, whether it's relevant to the job. So there's been a number of quote-unquote ban-the-box successes, the box on the application form being removed. So it's not that there isn't a time to take into account, if there's an appropriate set of things that somebody might have done wrong that are inconsistent with a particular job. Those can be taken into account, but not at the first page of the application, so that you never get into more detail or learn more about the person. The other thing that, another good strategy that we've worked on and helped other people to pursue is employment discrimination claims. The EEOC has very strong regulations that they recently developed that basically, because our criminal justice system is so disparately impacts racially African Americans particularly, when you screen out people because of a criminal conviction, you are almost by definition going to screen out disproportionate numbers of African Americans, and to the extent that that's not appropriate, it's a violation of Title VII. So one way to enforce proper hiring tactics or proper hiring procedures is to file complaints at the EEOC and pursue those, pursue employment discrimination. So those are a couple of the things. The other thing that's going on that's a little harder to tackle is that there are now a number of private services that sell information that for $50 will do a background check, so an employer can just pay, so they don't have to depend on the person telling them, you know, they'll pay and get a background check from these aggregators who, you know, get information from all the state and local criminal justice systems. They're frequently inaccurate. They frequently don't have complete records, so if a record was expunged, it might still be there. If somebody was arrested, it might not show the full course that the person was, ultimately those charges were dropped. That's a very hard handle to get on that. The Fair Credit Reporting Act that covers our own credit scores, you know, if you get denied a loan, you have a right to the credit report, and then you can challenge it, you can get the credit report fixed. That same law applies to these criminal record clearinghouses. So I think, but there's a lot of work. It's not just a simple law that needs to get passed, but there's a lot of work to stop the use of these kinds of aggregating systems. And some state and local officials sell the data just to raise money. So there's some communities where they're selling data about their own criminal justice history and convictions, and they're doing it to raise revenue. So that's something that can be stopped, to stop communities, local governments and state governments from actually selling their own data to employers.
One of the things that you mentioned earlier was a full employment plan. I mean, one of the things also that can really help people at the bottom of the wage distribution, people that are often discriminated against because of a criminal record or because they're a person of color, right? All the sorts of discrimination we have in the labor market is really working very hard to get tighter labor markets. So doing whatever we can to stimulate the economy, to reduce the unemployment rate, and that is going to do the best. And employers won't be able to be so picky and choosy about who they want to hire. And we can really broaden the base of the labor market.
Yes.
Okay. Hi. I just have a question because, like, a common conservative talking point is that government programs incentivize people to stay in lower wage jobs. So I was wondering if you guys could speak to that and the accuracy of that claim.
Sure,
again?
I can talk.
Just repeat the, I'm sorry.
He's saying that there's an incentive for workers to stay in low-paid jobs, otherwise they won't qualify for certain government programs.
Oh.
And I guess, right, am I correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So one of the things is that many government programs don't have a sharp cutoff value. I mean, that is not necessarily true of programs such as Medicaid, but programs such as SNAP or EITC, they have a gradual eligibility. The dollars that you can get gradually go down if you're in the phase-out range. That's what it's called, phase-out range. In the phase-out range of that program. And so even if you make more dollars and you're in that phase-out range, you're going to wind up still making more money on the whole. And so the incentive is pretty small to want to hold back, because your family income is going to go up greater than the losses that you might get. So on net, you're better off. So I think that those incentives, or that sort of perverse incentive structure, is absolutely overstated.
Hi, after listening to all this, I think I want to identify myself as definitely not Paul Ryan. We'll start with that. First of all, you presented so many realistic things that can be done. But any solution starts with a first step, as cliched as that is. So I want to do something hypothetical for each of you, if you would. If tomorrow you're named the Stop Child Poverty Czar, if there were such a thing. And you get to come up with the first step, and you can define it any way you want. I'll give you one suggestion, biggest bang for your buck, if you wanted to. What's the very first thing, directed each of you, that you think you would want to do? Take out the restrictions of politics, but this is what we want to do, because this is hypothetical. We can just play now in this world. What do you think would be the very best first step, and briefly, why?
I would move a plan forward through my cabinet to ensure that within the immediate future, a full employment program. I think there's little question but that is the strongest, most compelling solution, fundamentally and across the board. And you did say this was not needing to be politically realistic. So that would be the short answer. I mean, I think the longer answer is I would put some great minds together to think through stability in the household and what set of policies that were realistic and immediate would ensure stability and were lower hanging fruit. And a cluster of the ones that we've talked about today do that and are really there. I mean, paid leaves of all kinds, scheduling issues. We have, fortunately, a lot of campaigns at the state and local level that are succeeding in showing us the way, because Congress needs to follow. It doesn't need to lead, or it can't, or it doesn't. And these are really modest expenditures, if any expenditure. And so I think those steps are there, but I think it would help if the Academic Pediatric Association worked together to identify the priority stability pieces, and I would move for that in the cabinet.
It's hard to beat that. I mean, full employment makes a whole lot of sense. The only other thing I would maybe, and also it's hard to limit myself to one thing, but I would love to see a living wage implemented across the country. And also getting back to this issue in terms of the importance of civic engagement, because I think over the long haul, it's really important that we protect voting rights, because I really believe that we are moving in the right direction in terms of the political dynamic of the country. However, frankly, those who are currently in power are holding on to power like a cold dead hand right now. And the way they're doing it is by trying to cut off voting rights, making it more difficult for people to vote, having all sorts of crazy shenanigans going on, like what we just saw in Virginia with the Senate there, with the state Senate there, bribing people out of their seats so they can all of a sudden have a majority and therefore totally uproot an election. So there are real problems that we have just in terms of basic civic engagement in this country, and I think in the long term, the people know what's best for them, and if we were actually to live up to the ideal of democracy, in the future we're moving in the right direction.
So full employment, right, already been said. We absolutely need a full employment agenda. We are a rich country. I mean, I also believe that we should put more money in the hands of poor people. And that will reduce, that will make them be able to make ends meet. That will reduce stress. That will increase their stability. That will help kids, right? That's what all those studies say. They need more money. Let's get them more money. And let's do it in every way we can through the labor market. And if the labor market can't suffice, let's do it through our safety net. And I think that's the number one thing. And personally, I don't think it has to be targeted to buying only this or only that. I think that poor people are really the best at somehow scraping 2 pennies together and being able to feed their families. And let's stop putting so many restrictions on it. That's in the non-political environment we have. I think that's not possible, but I think that's what we should do.
Hi, Arnie Fagey with Public Advocacy for Kids. Are you?
One more person.
Pardon?
Oh, he's Steve.
No, that's okay. I don't have anything to add. I'm struck by what Ava said. I think there's both voting rights and getting money out of politics. If we could get money out of politics, it would make all of these things much, much easier to do. So if everybody had the right to vote and the 1% couldn't buy politicians and buy elections, I think we'd be 90% of the way home, because I think, like we said before, what we want is consistent with most people's values, what most people want, and we're only not getting it because of the political power of a very small number of folks, and that's largely because of the money that they've got. And then, going along with this issue of democracy, I guess the other democracy issue I would raise is that, if we could wave a magic wand and say that in every workplace, if majority workers want to be represented by a union, they would be represented by a union and they could bargain. That's how we're going to get living wages across the board that go well beyond whatever floor the government sets. People need power in the workplace the same way they need power in the political sphere in order to get a fair deal. So that would be one way of doing it.
We have 5 minutes left, so I think we have time for one more quick question.
Ready? My leader's over here. Arnie Faggy with Public Advocacy for Kids. I want to thank this panel. Talking about power and voting rights is totally refreshing and pumps you up. Cory Booker talked about, however, the uncommon partners bring uncommon results. If you had to define some of the uncommon partners that we need to bring along, besides the choir that's in this room this morning and many of the heroes at our local communities, what would you recommend?
Well, in the paid leave movement and the campaigns around the country that have been successful and those that are underway, there's been uncommon ground found with the business community. There are business leaders who understand the value of these paid leaves and are taking leadership positions in cities and in states to give voice to the reasons that they see paid leave helping their employees and ergo their businesses. So I think bringing in the business community is a vital step in a lot of these issue areas because they are often viewed as uncommon.
Okay, I'm going to say something totally crazy here. But, I'm struck by Tea Party activists who, in the same breath, will say that they hate government, will also say, hands off my Social Security or hands off my Medicare. And so I really think that there needs to be some serious public education that needs to happen around what exactly government looks like and what it really is in your life. Because I do believe that there are a lot of people who are just plain misinformed, and perhaps, hopefully, a sliver of them, if provided with the correct information, might be more likely to be in support of policies that actually help them rather than become unwitting accomplices in policies that hurt them and the rest of us at the same time.
I think similar to Avis, I think the idea of education, and on your side you're talking about government programs. I also think about, what did this growing income inequality mean for me, right? So this question of how does this impact me, the top 1%? So what? They did great. They did stupendously over the last 3.5 decades. That doesn't affect me. And it's absolutely incorrect. I think getting some education out there, in fact, I'm just going to plug it because I'm talking and you have to listen. We came up at the Economic Policy Institute, we just came up with this new wage calculator. And you can put in your wages today, and you can find out how much you would be making today if your wages actually kept up with productivity, what Steve was talking about, this sort of divergence between wages and productivity. So if you put in $50,000, you'd find out that you actually should be making $73,000 if the economy had treated everybody more fairly over the last 3 decades. So if you're making $60,000, you should be making more like $84,000. So if we get education, as Ava said, about the importance of government, we get education about what this growing gulf, this growing inequality has really meant for everyday people, I think we'll get a lot more allies.
I agree with Jody. I think one of the places that we've looked successfully, both small and large businesses, we're never going to probably get a majority of business folks to come out on some of these issues, but there are a lot who would, and I think their voices are influential. And I guess the other thing is, and it's not really an unusual ally, but I think for the masses of folks who just aren't that engaged in voting and in political things, it would be unusual if we had 80 or 90% turnout for an election. What would the world look like then? So I think just the notion of getting people who are disengaged, who don't think it makes a difference, who don't think it matters, or it doesn't matter who they vote for, their vote doesn't make a difference. If we could get those folks who are disengaged, engaged, at a minimum voting, but hopefully doing more than that, we would have a very, very different country than we've got right now.
On that note, let's give our panelists a round of applause. Thank you all.
for another fine panel, more than fine panel. We're going to take a half-hour lunch break and reconvene, I think, at 12:40. We appreciate the audience participation, and food is being served, so please help yourselves liberally.